Dear participants, greetings from Germany and welcome to our webinar on how to make money on the open source. We are thrilled to have you join us today. Whether you are a seasoned professional or just starting out in this field, we've curated an engaging session filled with insights, tips, and practical advice. My name is Jana. I'm a graduate recruitment counselor at Constructor.university Bremen, and I will be your host for today. Before we dive into today's webinar, let's quickly go over some housekeeping rules. Throughout this webinar, we encourage active participation, so feel free to utilize the chat feature to ask questions and share your thoughts in the chat. Right after the presentation, we will try to cover them all. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel after the event. If you'd like to revisit any part of the presentation or share it with colleagues who couldn't attend, you will have access to the recording shortly. Following the webinar, a feedback form will be emailed to all attendees. Your input is invaluable in helping us improve future webinars and tailor our content to better meet your needs. Please take a moment to fill out the form and share your thoughts with us. Thank you. So open source refers to software whose source code is freely available for anyone to view, use, modify, and distribute. It is important to say that open source is important because it fosters collaboration among developers, promotes innovation, and enhances accessibility to technology. It empowers individuals and organizations to customize and improve software, leading to faster development cycles, higher quality products, and greater flexibility in addressing diverse needs. Now, it is with great pleasure that I introduce Monty, the main author of the original version of the open source MySQL database, a founding member of the MySQL AB company, and CTO of the MariaDB Corporation AB. Additionally, he is a founder and general partner at venture capital firm OpenOcean. As the co-creator of MySQL, one of the most widely used open source databases, Monty has left an indelible mark on the software industry. His vision, innovation, and commitment to open source principles have revolutionized how we store and access data. Without further ado, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Monty. We are honored to have you with us today. Please join me on the virtual stage.
Thank you for the kind words. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about what is open source, so why is it, in my opinion, a better development model, and then also what you need to take into account if you want to be an entrepreneur and make money on open source. So next slide. So one of the reasons lots of people say why open source is better is because there you have more people who look at your code, use it in different ways that you would expect, so you get much broader usage of it. And Eric Raymond emphasized that code reviewers will make the code better, but that is only really true in really big projects where there are lots of participants, because then all code will be moderated, checked on, and so on. Smaller project, not so much. So there's I have collected some reasons why open source is better than closed source. In my view, the biggest importance is no vendor lock-in, which means that when you use open source, you have more than one vendor. You're not depending on one company who can just decide to increase prices or just close the project from you. You have better quality because you have more developers, and lots of things are developed by the users. And usually you have better support because you have many companies who can do the support. And of course, for those who are economically inclined, usually open source is either totally free, or if you actually want to support the community and get support and everything else, it's still 1/10 of the cost of commercial closed source software. Next. There have been some people who have claimed that can you really trust open source? Because the code is available, it's so easy to sneak in something that will do something bad. It's extremely seldom that I have seen that in practice, and there have been universities who have tried to prove that you can sneak code into Linux, and they failed miserably, and they got banned from being part of the Unix community, at least for some time. Even NASA has tried to add backdoors, especially in encryption, because NASA would like to be able to see what everybody's doing, and the Linux community has found those and plugged those holes. Next slide. There are also lots of FAD about open source that can you really trust it and everything else. So my slides are made in such a way that I will try to not repeat what's on the slide so much, but more the slide is used as a reference for you in the future. And this is a good example on. There were recently, some years ago, a web site who claimed that there's lots of problems with open source. And here I just try to categorize this. It means that the person has no understanding on what's open source or what he's talking about. So this is more a reference slide. So next. So when looking at open source, why are developers and companies using open source? For me, it has always been a better way to develop software. You get more developers, you get more spread, means that there are lots of people using it, they recommend your software to others, and that way your product spreads. MySQL would have never been possible if I would have done that as a closed source project, especially in a very competitive world. So this works very good for it works very good for projects that can where you that is can become popular, where you have lots of users. But it's very hard to. The problem with open source is that because your product is free, anybody can download it, use it, extend it. It's really, really hard to get money. And why do you get money? Want to have money? Most of those who are working open source are working for a company who is extended open source. But there are also lots of people who are doing that from home, and they need a way to get a living. And especially hard it is to create a company who can actually do open source, do something good, and at the same time be able to pay all the bills. And this is what this talk is all about. Next. So this is one of quotes from Bruno, who was basically is saying that in his experience, it's totally impossible to make a successful company on the Apache software license, which is one of the most free open source licenses. And he later changed that to more restrictive license, GPL, and then he suddenly made much more business. So and this is that different. He was using the fact that different open source licenses has different restrictions how you can use it, and that's also something we used with MySQL. I will come back to the licensing by the end of the talk. Next. So the reason people are creating an open source project or a company around open source is that one of the common reasons is that you have a problem, you want to solve it, and then you want to share it. That's basically what happened with both MySQL and with Linux. Linus Torvalds was doing a pet project for himself. Lots of people got excited, and then it just started to spread. Also, you can do research. You can do something that you're working on a company. And one thing that was at least happened lots in the past, that the company had a product that they didn't know what to do with, and they didn't want to develop it so much more for themselves, so they made it open source. And that basically what happened to Netscape. And also that a lot of people also create a small open source project just to be able to show to others that how good you are as a programmer, to be able to use that as a building block for getting a job somewhere else. And there's also people who just want to give something back to the community. So when I created MySQL, originally I liked the fact that this is a project that they're helping a lot of people if you have to pay, but it was actually doing something really good. And I also wanted to give something back to the open source community, because before MySQL had used free software for almost 10 years and always wanted to give something back. MySQL was the first project that was good enough that we could give to the community, but we also wanted to have a license that could ensure that we can work on this full time, because I didn't want to have a job on the side to earn money for the family, and then have a after work job just to work on MySQL. Next slide. So one common question I do get is that, so why is anybody wanted to do work on open source if they're not getting paid? And why are people wanting to use open source software? And I will just say that this is kind of how humans work. As a user, you want to use open source because it's free, it's good, and it solves usually your problems. It doesn't be always as good as the best possible commercial one, but it's usually good enough. So that's why you use it. And then sooner or later, especially if you're a developer, you notice that the software is good, but it's not really good enough. You need to have some extensions or some changes. And then you have two options. You move to something else, or you change the software that you already like to be what you want to. And that's why people get involved in open source. And that also, of course, when you release it, your changes, it's also a way to increase your reputation. And the reason people then commit to open source is that now you have done some changes. You don't want to keep those changes to yourself, because then for each release of the software, you have to do the changes over and over again. So it's better to give it back to the community. And this way, that creates a circle and everybody benefits. And that's why open source is constantly evolving, because there are people and companies who are changing the open source for their own benefits, and everybody benefits. Next slide. So if you want to start an open source project, you usually should have a good idea what you want to do, because just thinking that I can make money on this little thing usually doesn't work. You need to have something that you know how it will be solved. So for example, if you have a house, maybe you're interested in house automation, then you should do a project on house automation, because when you solve it for yourself, and there's lots of other people have the same problem, you usually have a good start for a project that could be commercially interesting. But you should always check that if there are already existing projects that you could be participating in, because it's always easier to be part of a group who's solving a problem than to create something that's competing with other groups. And there's lots of examples of people who hasn't followed that and just failed. That's why you have so many dead projects on GitHub and other places. And when you have something working, you need to find either a group of users or a company who are interested in that project. And then you continue working with that group or company to enhance it. And this way you will get both money to continue your work, but also have your theory and your project battle tested in real life. And of course, when you do this as an entrepreneur or would-be entrepreneur, you just have to ensure that you keep all the rights to what you do to yourself, so that you can continue with it after you have finished working with a company who has helped bootstrap your code. And also with open source, it's not about just the software. Just because you had the best program in the world doesn't mean it become popular. You also have to work on building a community, an active community. The more user you have who participates on your forums, websites, knowledge base, or blogs, the more attractions you will get to your project. And you also need to make it very easy for the community to participate in your project, which means that you need to have forums, web pages. You have to be very, very active with helping users, both using your product and also developers to be part of your product. So a big part of the creating MySQL was doing all these things. And we also did, like we do in MariaDB, we built packages, binaries for all distributions, all different compilers, all different hardware, because we wanted everybody to have easy access to MySQL and MariaDB. And we were one of the first who actually did take this seriously, because in the old times, you could just get source code and you had to compile them yourself. But that also means that often things didn't work out because it was not tested on all platforms. So this is kind of important to make it easy for people to get access to your project and use it. And also to create an active community, you need good team. You need to who knows how to be friendly to your community. And usually it helps to have a leader that keeps everybody together and creates spirit around the project. So for what I did for MySQL originally was that during the first 5 years, I tried to ensure that every single email was answered, and if there were some hateful discussions on the email list, I interfered and then solved them and told people that they need to respect both the views and the products they are using. And I also believe that if you have a project, you also need to teach the people who are contributing to projects how to code things in a way that is useful for the project. You don't want to have different coding styles within one project, because it makes things very, very hard to maintain. And also, you also need to engage with your developers so that they grow as the project is growing. Next slide. And when it comes to what people think about the project, so everything is about transparency. People need to know that they can trust that your open source project is going to survive. That it will not just change licenses or disappear in the middle. They need to know about your roadmap and how do you release this, when you do releases. So it's much more important for an open source company than a closed source company to be open about what you plan to do and what you're doing, your bugs. Because you don't have money to have lots of marketing and advertisement and spread your information about your product. It's basically users who are doing that. And they don't do that if they really trust you. So, and also, if you promise something, you need to do your best to keep your promises, because otherwise people will just say that we can trust that. Will that feature ever be done or not? Next slide. And also you need to communicate with your community. So for example, MariaDB is extensively used in the DBase database as a service by service providers. And I'm just now at the conference CloudFest, where we have lots of MariaDB users. I'm here, yeah, not as much to get customers, but as much also to listen to people, see what can we do to make MariaDB better for them, spread information about MariaDB, have talks, interact with people. And that's how basically you create your community. And also when people donate code to your project, you have to treat that code with respect, because that's something that they gave to you. And if you do a lot of changes to it, and so much changes that the product doesn't anymore do what the person who donated the code wanted to do, you will just make him unhappy, and he will not want to be part of your project anymore. And one common mistake that people do when they make the code open source or free software is that they just will believe that, no, it's open source, no, we get lots of people participating because this is such a cool project, so everybody want to be here. The thing is that for people to want to produce code, they first need to go through what we have on the previous slide. They first need to download the project, use it, like it, want to use it, and then have a need to expand it. That's when you get new code. So usually when you have released the first code drop, it may take 3 months, 6 months before you start to get active participation. And it's only how you treat the people who participate that will tell you or ensure what will happen in the future. If you get more people, will the old people be active or not? So you need to treat them with respect. Next slide. And you also need to be a good open source citizen, so that basically you need to treat developers the way that you would expect it to be treated if you would be the one who contributes code. You need to also provide good feedback, because nobody likes it when you give a code to a project and then you get to know that the code will be available in the project after half a year. So that means that you can't use it just now when you need it. I'm also actively myself in different forums helping people using MariaDB, and if there are bugs, I'm doing my best to help them get around those or fix them. And you shouldn't talk bad about competing projects. You should talk about what you know mostly about your project. You should emphasize what you know and not try to talk bad about projects that you probably don't know as much as you know about your project. So you're basically being a good open source citizen that will get you people to trust you. They would like to work with you, and you can easily create that way a successful project. And you need to start early, because building a project, a community around a project later, it's much harder than when you start, when you actually need help, both in development, but also spreading the information about your project. Next slide. And one of the most common mantras in open source is release early, release often, which basically means that you want people to see your ideas early, so they can tell you that this is a good idea. Oh, have you thought about this and this? Because you get help, much easier to get help early. And if you wait to release at the late stage, then somebody else may already have started a project, and it's very hard to get, or basically you are sharing the possible developers with some other projects that would never have materialized if you would have done things early. And also, no problem if there are bugs in the beginning. If it's a new project, people expect that to be bugs. But the other people will help you overcome those, find solution for those. And you just need to be clear about what to expect of the project. Is this something you can put in production, or this is something that you should test first extensively before you put that into production? All that should be clear from the beginning. And don't be afraid to release if it has bugs, as long as you document what works and doesn't. Next slide. And you also need to make it easy to get and use your product. So you, in the beginning, before you are in the distribution, you should release both binaries and source so that people can get access to your product very quickly. And of course, you should try to ensure that everything is bug-free. It's hard in the beginning, but doing your best will help. And then when you get some popularity, you need to work with all the different Linux and OS distributions to get your product in there, because that's the way that you get lots of users. And of course, it needs to work on all platforms, which is probably one of the hardest things with a new project. But if you have lots of people helping you, that usually is not that hard. Next slide. So how successful is open source? Most of the big companies, that exist wouldn't exist without open source. So Apple built everything originally on open source. It's not so open anymore, but without open source, there would be no Apple. If you look at the data centers, most of the code is open source. And much of the new technology, especially among SaaS providers, is open source. Because when a SaaS provider starts to use new hardware, new CPUs, and new SSDs, they can't use commercial hardware, commercial software, because they are not ready for this new hardware, especially if you are going from a CISC to a RISC processor. So the only thing that the hardware or SaaS providers can do is use open source. And up to around 2007, it looks like open source will kind of become the new standard of a big part of the infrastructure, and also for basically all software. But when iPhone and Android entered the market, we actually got a total new class of software that is totally closed. I'm talking about the all apps. Unfortunately, most of the apps that exist today are closed source. And that from an open source developer point of view, that is quite unfortunate. And I can understand that, because it's very hard to earn money on an app which is free. But actually, there's some open source license that can be used even by apps and ensure that you make enough money to be able to sustain yourself. And that will be on the next pages. Next slide. So now we're starting to move to the business part over here of doing business with open source. So one problem is that many people see open source more as a philosophy and a development model, and doesn't take into account that you actually have to earn money on that, or at least somebody has to earn money. And there's no guarantee with open source that you will get enough money developing software to be able to continue developing your product. And there are very, very few open source companies who have done an IPO on open source. And then there is some projects like Talent, who is almost open, but the SaaS offerings are not free. Let's go to the next slide. So when thinking about what kind of products make sense to do open source, and how are they developed, you had projects developed by community. And then typical larger projects like Linux, MariaDB, Apache, and so on. And then you have tools that are released by a company who are basically doing the major development, and then there's open source to get help from the community to enhance it in different ways. And of course, there's also the thing that we had on MySQL time. You have a small team who decided that we want to be part of the open source movement, and but we need a better way to deliver the software than the normal commercial route. So that's why we with MySQL we choose to be open source as soon as we figured out the license, so that could ensure that we could work on it full time. Next slide. So when it comes to business model, there's two things that people need to understand. When you talk with investors and you have your great company or idea for a company, and you go to the investor, and then the first thing they will ask you, especially if you're open source. So what kind of company is this? Is this a service company or software company? This software company means that you are selling licensing the people have to pay for. So if you have a service company who has a revenue of 1 million, the investor will tell you that your company is worth 2 million. But if it's a software company, it's worth 10 million. That's why it's essential if you want to do a really big, successful open source company, you need to be able to do licensing also in some form. Otherwise, you will not get the 10x or 10x revenue valuation that you want to have. Next one. That was probably the most important slide in this presentation to understand. And then, of course, you need to find out what's the finance or come up with what's the financial goal of the company. There's nothing wrong with being a small company who make a good living supporting a small group of other companies. But with MySQL, I basically wanted to compete with the big vendors, change the world, reduce the price of databases, because without that, the internet would never have been possible. So we wanted to basically go public on the stock market or sold on the market. But it's good to, in the beginning, decide what kind of company you want to be, because the license that you choose depends on that. Slide. So why go open source? Because it's so nice to be able to sell licenses, get the 10x valuation. The thing is also that it's much harder nowadays to sell closed source projects, because if you go to if you're a small company and you have a closed source project and you go to another company and try to sell it, that company doesn't have guarantees that you will survive. With open source, they will know that somebody else will be able to continue if you suddenly would disappear, because you can make enough money on it. So with open source, you have more users, you have lower cost, higher quality, but you also have a little bit harder to make money on it. But yeah, there's lots of big benefits of why you would like to go open source. Next slide. And so why does users and companies trust an open source vendor? It's basically what was in the beginning. There's no vendor lock-in. Then they know that you can't, even if you go away or disappear, you still can continue using your product and even continue developing it. So there's less risk that with a commercial closed source vendor that disappears and instantly the product is unusable for you. And also with open source projects, there's much less risk of hidden trapdoors that suddenly can come in and steal your business secrets and so on. Next slide. For developers, why they prefer open source is that you can get access to the code and get all the benefits of open source and free software. So you can change, you can adapt the software to your needs. And if there's a bug, if the original developer doesn't fix it quickly enough, you can fix it. It doesn't mean that everybody's capable of fixing it, but at least you have the possibility to fix that. And you also have freedom to find somebody else who can do this for you. And freedom to not to do whatever they want to do with the code, even doing a competing project. Next slide. So then the question is, when should you go open source? Because normally you start by developing your projects a little bit hidden because you don't really know who is your user base, who will be your potential customers. But I would say that you should go open source when either because you want to have the spread immediately or when you have figured out how you can do sustainable business around open source so that you can actually afford to hire people. And choosing the right license is the most critical decision that you do that will have effect on all your future commercial opportunities. Next slide. So in open source, you basically have only, there are lots of open source licenses, but in practice, there's only these 5 matters, where public domain is the most free, and AGPL has restrictions that in some cases forces people to have to pay you to be able to use the code. So next slide. So when we come to the business models, here's the most common business model that exists on open source, where open core is probably still the most common one. Dual licensing, that was something that was used by MySQL, and we were the first one who was used it on BGPL. And then, of course, you have service models, which is a good way to earn money, but it's really hard to create a really big company because of you only have a valuation about two of them, of the services. And then your subscriptions, donations, and also you can do a non-profit foundation and hope that you can get enough people to contribute to that. Next slide. So I know you have we'll have one slide for each different business model. So with open core, that basically means that the big part of your code is open, but for some critical modules, it will not be available to anyone. So this is basically what Oracle is doing with MySQL, where ever increasing number of features are closed source. And what is important to understand that this is not an open source model, because all the things that you expect as a user open source suddenly has disappeared if you need any of the modules which are closed source. That means you can change, modify, or do anything with the code because you don't have all the code that you need. And you have one vendor who can at any point in time say that, no, we think that you should pay next year twice for your product, for the uses of the software. And you have to pay because you don't have any other choice. So personally, I don't believe that open core is a good business model because I like the freedom that the open source gives you. But if you don't have any other choice, at least this is better than having be totally closed, because at least you are providing something to the open source community. Next slide. Some people also tried to do donation and crowdfunding to do software projects. The problem with crowdfunding is that it works very good for initial project or a project that has a very short lifetime, like a game. when the game is done and you had sorted out all the bugs, there's nothing left to be done. But if you want to do a project that actually changes the world, that has to have releases over and over again, every year by year, this doesn't work, because you will only get crowdfunding or donations for the first project. And getting that over time for bigger one is almost impossible. Next slide. So dual license is something that was first used by GoScript. That is something that is software that is found in most printers, and MySQL was the second product to use it, and first on GPL. The idea is that you have exactly the same code under two licenses. For us, we had GPL, and then we provided the same code with only a header change to, let's say, the new license to companies who couldn't use GPL, because GPL has the effect that if you combine that with other software, that software also becomes GPL. So we, for example, had some companies who embedded MySQL inside a project. Adobe was one of them, and they didn't want Adobe to become GPL. So they paid to get exactly the same license with closed source and only usable for them. So this was how we earned almost half of the money in MySQL. And the rest come from services and support and things like that. Next slide. But the problem with GPL is that it only works for infrastructure projects, because if you have to do, for example, a game, nobody will want to enhance that game. And if you do it then as open source, people just copy the game, and you will not get any money for that. So that's why me and David Axelmar created the business source license, that is, it's not open source license, but it has many of the same freedoms that does open source. The idea is that the source code is available from the start. After some years, usually 2 or 3, it becomes open source. So this still has restrictions that if, for example, we have a product in MariaDB called MaxScale, that we say that you can only use it together with 2 servers. But after some years, you can use it free. So at least it's better than open core, because if the vendor would disappear, you can still continue using it. And you maybe have to pay for some time for the software, but at least you are not depending on one vendor. Anybody can give support for it. Next slide. And we have only a few minutes, so we'll go quick through the slides. So these slides just emphasize that with business source, you don't have a vendor locking, or source code is available. You can fix bugs. You can do most of the things. So it's not as good as open source, but it's close enough, and it will generate more open source code over time, because the code is guaranteed to be open source. Next slide. We can skip this one. Yeah. So the recommendation is basically that you should have a short time before the code becomes open source. You should tune the license so that most can use it freely, because that's the way that you get spread of the product. And if you have a product that are used by millions of users, having 1 in 1,000, like we had in MySQL, would pay, that's really a good business. And you should then have the free version, commercial version should have the identical source code. Next slide. And here's some background. This you can look at this later. Next slide. And there are also lots of discussions about why did me and David invent the business source license. That was to help other entrepreneurs to be almost open source when when they couldn't earn money in any other way. Next slide. So there's just more and more companies who are starting to adapt this one. We have Cockroach, HashiCorp, and some of the early adopters who tried BSL, and for some reason it didn't work for them. But that is a longer discussion. Next slide. And actually, this may be a question later, so we can take next slide. And there's another license that are very close to business source. You have a common clause that basically source is available, but you need a license for commercial usage. There's some links for that. Next one. And here's an example how a common clause license would look like. Next slide. You have also other source available licenses like Redis Labs and Confluent. The problem with these is that their license agreement is big and complex. It's not as easy as a business source license, which is usually very short and just says that you can use it freely unless under these conditions. And at this date, it will become open source. So I think the business source license is a more clear license compared to this. Next slide. And last, MySQL would never have been possible if we wouldn't have been able to sell licenses. And even if only 1 in 1,000 did pay for the licenses, when you have 50 million servers running MySQL, it was not hard to get paid for that, and that also attributed to that Sun did buy us for $1 billion, even if we only had about 80 million in revenue, because with 80 million revenue from software, that gave us with a 10x multiplier, that gave us a valuation of 800 million, and then with hundreds of millions of users, that was why the MariaDB was evaluated as 1 billion. And licenses, it's free money for the project. You do things once, and then people pay and pay again. There's nothing similar when doing just support or services. And I think that can be the last slide. So almost on time.
On behalf of everyone attending today's webinar, I want to extend a heartfelt thank you to you, Monty, for sharing such insightful and valuable information with us. I think our attendees were able to understand more about open source and how to use it. Now let's transition to our Q&A session. We have our pre-canned questions, which have been submitted to us in advance. In the meantime, I encourage everyone to also pose any additional questions you may have in the chat. We'll do our best to address all of them during the Q&A session. The first question would be key mistakes to avoid when seeking to monetize your open source project.
I would say the most critical thing is that you shouldn't talk with investors until you don't need them. And that's what we were successful doing with MySQL. Basically, it means that you should try to find a way to monetize and prove that you can earn money. Because if you don't, and you go to an investor, either they will just dismiss you because you don't earn enough money, or you don't have an idea how to earn more money, but they will also try to buy 50 or 60% of the company to get control. If you already earn a lot of money and you don't need more money, then you are in control, and you can tell investors that you will only be able to buy 10% because I'm not prepared to say more. And then you are still interesting for them if you can show that you can earn much more money with their investment. So you should never be in a place where you have to take the money.
Okay, thank you so much. The next question would be main risks and challenges, either technical, legal, or maintenance, on monetizing open source.
If you choose the wrong license, and that probably will be the biggest problem. For example, if you choose a Apache license, which is a great license for a community project, but if you are the one who has created all the software, and then you will want to go to get investment for be able to hire, let's say, 10, 20, 50 developers, you will not be able to do that as easy, because anybody can come in and make a copy of your project and create a separate company and compete with you. So you need to think about the license.
True. Okay. The next one would be, how can students contribute to open source projects while still in the university?
One common way is the Google Summer of Code projects. There is actually one going, I think, now, where students can participate with a well-known open source project and be part of that, and learn both how to communicate in open source environment, also get credits for future employer that say that I contributed to this project. The more you contributed, usually the more attractive you are for future employers. So and choosing a project is usually the hardest part, but if you have something that you care about, you should find a project in that area and then find out how to contribute. I know each project has different rules and different difficulties that you have to tackle to be part of the project. So for example, to make it easy to contribute to MariaDB, I created a MariaDB Foundation, which they're actively helping people to contribute. So that's and you should try to find projects like that, so that you don't spend too long time to getting in your first patches.
Thank you so much for this information. Meantime, we have one more question addressing to you in our chat. What programming language would you recommend for the future for backend and program development? I see C++ being used majorly currently, but I also see most new projects being made with Rust, which is supposed to have far better memory management amongst other advantages.
So personally, I like C, but that's because I like to have full control. I heard a lot of good things about Rust and Python. They have the advantages, but I kind of always wanted to get out every ounce of performance you can get out from a machine, and also we have in MySQL and MariaDB we created a lot of security around memory management that usually other people don't do that. If you don't know how to handle memory, then modern C++ actually is really strong with memory protection, or Rust, or then you just go to Python where you don't have to care about memory. But if you really want to know how your machine works and be seen as one of the hardcore engineers that can do anything, then C is probably one of the best ones.
Thank you so much. I think it answers the question. The next one would be, how can we find good open source projects to contribute to?
GitHub is full with open source projects, but as I said earlier, try to find a niche that you're interested in and that relates to your study. For example, if you're interested in history and relations, how people related to each other, you should go to some archive or find some project where that try to find all relatives to different persons and so on. You need to go where your heart is, because if you want to, let's say there's two kind of developers. One to just go from job to job and just does what they are told to. And then you have people who have find a mission, want to change the world, and want to work on one project their whole life. But of course, it has to be, then it has to be interesting for you. It has to solve problems that you think are interesting. And that's the kind of project you should find.
Okay, thank you so much. And I extend my heartfelt thanks to today's speaker for delivering such an exceptional and insightful presentation. It was truly remarkable. And I'd like to remind everyone that the recording will be available on YouTube, where you can also post your questions for future discussion. Shortly after the presentation, you will be receiving the feedback form. We are kindly asking you to fill out the form and submit it to us. I would also like to quickly remind you that the application deadline to our university is slowly approaching, so check out our study programs with the QR code on the slide. Thank you once again for your participation and have a good evening.
Bye-bye.